I think I'm going to use, Annika, your structure to reply to a bit, rather than work off of the notes I prepared. Mostly because I agree with most of what you said. I think that the politic, the bottom line is that COVID, I think, is an accelerator more than a dynamic that's going to change peacekeeping in itself. It's taking a lot of trends and a lot of dynamics that were already in place, and just we're fast forwarding. As Jean-Marc said, we've begun to see budget cuts in peacekeeping. We saw them under the Obama administration, and those are continuing, and they will continue at a faster pace. We've also seen, I think, there's been a fatigue in our large missions, particularly in Africa, and I think that will continue. And the polarization certainly has, is more evident than ever. I don't think it's a result of COVID, but it is certainly come to the fore in the last few months. So what does that mean for peacekeeping going forward? I think with regard to, what you described as the politics, I agree. I think we're going to be looking at more missions that are developed in a multilateral, but not necessarily in multilateral manner, but not necessarily through the Security Council. That is going to be a heavy lift for some countries. I think that Africa is actually quite well placed. The AU has a great deal of experience in this already. Funding, of course, will remain an issue, but that is something that they can get and assist with. I think it's going to be more difficult for other parts of the world. I think the Middle East is one that Jean-Marc highlighted. It is going to be more challenging to find multilateral cooperation there. That may be an area where the UN's good offices remain extremely important. Going to some of expertise and resources, and I wanted to reply to Natasha a bit here. I mean, there are so many aspects of, of this entire discussion that are already, the answers are already out there. We have had 20 years of thinking on what is wrong with peace operations and what needs to be done to fix them. Since the Brahimi report, many of which, much of which was repeated in the high-level independent panel on peace operations report, those recommendations still stand. They still make sense. We need missions that are more flexible, that are more people-centered. I think, Natasha, a lot of the challenges that you raised, the kinds of expertise we need in our missions, is totally correct. I think it's something we also could achieve with the right mechanisms in place. If we treated peacekeeping staff more like agency staff with more flexible contracts, the ability to attract, high-level experienced consultants. I think that there's a lot more room for innovative thinking here. That is going to require lifting some of the political constraints in New York, constraints decided by member states, not necessarily by the Secretariat. And I think that's an important point to highlight. Not that COVID and the budget cuts couldn't serve as an important incentive for the Secretariat, because I think that there are some entrenched positions that we can push things along. I know that EOSG is thinking seriously about ways to really innovate peacekeeping, and I think in some respects even beyond some of the ways we're talking about here. What does peacekeeping for the future look like? Traditional peacekeeping missions were neutral observers. That seems to me a less relevant capacity in an age where knowing what's going on the ground is the province of spy satellites and signal intelligence and so many capacities that are, much more effectively carried out by governments. We don't necessarily need a soldier on the ground to tell us whether a ceasefire has been violated. Not that the UN's neutral and impartial status is no longer necessary, but I think that basic idea of boots on the ground may have to be rethought. In addition to that, of course, is the idea of hybrid warfare. Having a soldier monitoring a ceasefire line does not do you much good if it's a cyber attack we're talking about. At the same time, I think that the multidimensional missions we've seen in the last 2 decades are also going to have to be rethought. Those missions were often, I think, conceived of as platforms. We often heard of Christmas tree mandates, in which the mission was tasked to do a whole range of things. There is, I think, fatigue with that, not only because of the success and the results are questionable, but also because it's proven very expensive. Looking at how to do some of those things in a more efficient, more flexible way is going to be important. And I think when it does come to our boots on the ground, and I think there will be a role for that going forward. We're going to have to recognize, I think if there's one lesson I've learned working on peacekeeping and particularly on the protection of civilians in the last decade and a half, is that it is very difficult to get your personnel to put themselves in harm's way, or at least their capitals to put them in harm's way if there is not some national interest involved. And so, the traditional concept of disinterested peacekeepers is going to have to be reconciled with the idea of more dangerous missions. And finally, I did want to touch on some of the most important capacities that I think have to be developed around the civilian staff. We can still do protection. We can still promote human rights without 15,000 troops. We are going to need to look more to the monitoring and reporting that some of which Natasha spoke to, the mediation and good offices that go on regularly on the ground in missions all around the world, but I think do not get the attention and really the professionalization that they deserve. These kinds of activities are going to need to be focused on more than I've seen within the organization in recent times. And finally, I think on communities, we are going to need to focus more on community engagement, not only in peace operations, but also for the UN as a whole. So let me end there. Thank you so much.